Welcome to From the Files of Dr. Mac, hosted by J.J. McCollister. The heritage portion of interests, Blacks in the Bible, Her Story, includes women in the Bible, prominent issues which can be handled with biblical Christian counseling, as well as comments regarding current media content regarding women. And now, Dr. Mac.
Well, hello, and welcome to the webcast from the Biblical Files of Dr. Mac. I am your host, Dr. Mac. Today we're going to continue our Women in the Bible series. Our focus today will be on Abigail, Nabal, and David, the future king of Israel. As you know, we're going straight through the Bible, and it's interesting to see how women are presented. Last week we took care of Ruth. We discussed Ruth. So this time we will talk about Abigail, who's a very interesting character who at times appears to be quite young, and at other times she seems to have the wisdom of the ages. So I would like for you to sit back and enjoy. Our scriptures, biblical scriptures, come primarily from 1 Samuel chapter 25, and the supplemental references will come from Judges chapter 14, 2 Samuel 20, and Luke chapter 1, 38, chapter 6, 27 verse through 36 verse. Now, the story of Abigail and David ranks among the most exciting, at the same time, most difficult to understand in the Bible. The wife of a rich man, when she met David, Abigail possessed beauty, intelligence, political shrewdness, and material wealth that helped David at a critical moment when he could have thrown away his chance at success. One of the things that we will get to talk about today is that relationship. We'll look at Abigail as a wife of Nabal, then Abigail as a widow for a very short time, then Abigail as the wife of David. When these two met, Abigail and David, David was on the run from Saul, and he was in Priam, in the valley of Moab, near the city of Carmel. So technically, David was an outlaw here, and Abigail was a traditional ancient Israeli wife. So King Saul had thought, and rightly so, that David was a threat to his throne, and he was camping out in the wilderness, and he was trying to build up an army, a following, as it were. It would be an army today. But that at this point, he just needed those to follow him who believed in him. And one of the most interesting things that we have here at it is that it was the women who were the ones who basically were instrumental, first of all, in being prophetic, believing that he would be the king, and assisting him in all manner. So Abigail's marriage to Nabal, who was a very wealthy man, gave her considerable social status, judging by the fact that she had 5 maidservants, and that's in 1 Samuel chapter 25, verse 42. However, Abigail's husband is described in Scripture as being a hard man, an evildoer, a cruel, you know. He made us wonder why such a paragon of virtue as Abigail would have married him in the first place. Well, going back, we know that these marriages were arranged marriages, and Abigail would have been no different in that her marriage to Nabal would have been set up by her father, by the family. Um, Nabal is considered rude and intemperate, and that brings Abigail and David together. So we will look at Abigail under those pastures. We will also take a look at Abigail in terms of distinct personality traits. So let's get started. Well, this story, uh, 1 Samuel, is a transition from the book of Judges to God's king in First Samuel. So the book of First Samuel records a change in the way Israel is ruled. The book presents us with the transition from judges to kings, but in a particular way. Um, from judges, we will do this transition not just to any king, but later to God's king. God had someone chosen. Someone had been anointed even before Saul was no longer king. And he was anointed by Samuel because he is the king. One of the political statements that's very current today is that you get the kind of ruler that you deserve. So we still have bits and pieces of Judges, the culture from the book of Judges floating around here in the book of Samuel. So the transitional figures that we have so far are going to be, we know, uh, Saul and David. So what we have is a moving away from a tribal setting into a national setting. We're actually making up, building up what became the early ancient Israel of its day. So the prophet of the Lord, and anytime that is said or written like that, it becomes Samuel that we're talking about. Was somewhat surprised that they wanted a human king. They had not done well with the humans who had become judges. So it became very clear when this was done, and God said to Samuel that you do what the people want done. And we're still working around in verse 1 in Samuel, first chapter. So, what authority did Samuel have to make this transition? Well, God had appointed him. Remember, God, going back very quickly, before Samuel was born, his mother dedicated him to God. So he's raised in the temple with Eli. He becomes a judge and then later a prophet. And as you read through this first section of First Samuel, you understand that that authority was needed, to accomplish the things that needed to be accomplished. So we have no king, and we're going back to Judges 21st chapter, 25th verse. And we're understanding now that the worship at the tabernacle at Shiloh has been degraded by the priest Eli and his sons and the sins that they committed. And it's interesting to note that those sins did not rub off on Samuel in any way. And we won't spend time going through the story there of what they did and the punishment thereof. We want to move right on into that book of Samuel that we have to focus on. The author of the book of Samuel, by the way, is Samuel, but there are others who are associated with the writing of this historical book, sometimes referred to as a book of wisdom, but it is basically the record of going from one to the other. So basically, after Saul's death, there's great mourning upon the land. You got to remember who Samuel, after Samuel's death, I hope that's what I said, who Samuel was to David. He not only was the one who anointed David king very early in his life, but he served as a mentor as well as a protector for David. And Samuel was also very much an intercessor between the people of Israel and what had to be done. So, big words that we have to deal with at this transitional period is disobedience. So was a major reason why Samuel had to do the intercessory work, because the people were not as bad as they were doing what they thought was right in their own eyes. They'd come a little ways from that, but they were still sinning. They were moving away from what had been taught them. So this disobedience causes them to, well, they sinned, but it seems to be within the nature of the people, especially the ones we're reading about, that they do at some point sin. And Saul is referred to as a dark shadow. He's a man who cast a dark shadow over a man who was after God's own heart. Because God had chosen David very early on. And David was beloved by the people, which was a thorn in Saul's side. One of the themes that we'll talk about here is God's sovereignty in his providence, and it exemplifies the commitment and the submission to the sovereign Lord. So one of that is one of the very first things that we have to talk about, and that becomes the issue when we have to deal with um, those who want what they want and how they want it. So we have to deal with that. And the other thing that we want to take a look at is the sovereignty of God's work through the grace that leads to salvation as we go through this study of Samuel. Randy McCracken talks about the theology that's in Samuel, and for him, he uses the word theology as the big picture. So, looking at that, we're going to tackle some major topics. And in the book of Samuel, what we will see now is a beginning and an end. In Samuel 1, we see the beginning of a king who is divine in many aspects, who's chosen by God. And we also see the death of Saul between 1 and 2, and then we see the crowning or the anointing of David as the dominant king. But one of the things that I realized is that in the stories within the book of Samuel 1 and 2, we're only discussing four main families. Only four main families. And we need to take a look at that. Those stories, the stories that are about the families, or the family of Samuel, the family of Eli, which we covered very early, were coming out of Saul's family and moving into David's family. I don't know if you thought about it that way, but it's interesting to see that they are all related in some way. And the reason that they are so related is because there's a cause and effect upon them. And the special relationship that they have starts with the heads of those families. For example, Samuel becomes a surrogate son to Eli. Saul becomes a surrogate son of Samuel. And David becomes a surrogate son of Saul. So these relationships connect the leading figures of the book of Samuel 1 and the book of Samuel 2. Not only is there a connection, but it is also a literary technique that moves the story forward. So we have the four families that we'll deal with. And an interesting side note is that the word son occurs 300 times in between Samuel 1 and Samuel 2. The word house, not meaning a physical house, but actually the family or the dynasty, um, as in the house of Saul or in the house of David. It occurs about 176 times. The word father occurs 82 times. So we have the repetitiveness that gives us an idea that there could possibly be the concept of hopefulness among the verses that we'll study. So let's break it down. Samuel in First Samuel, chapters 1 and 2, it depicts the end of the period of the judges as stated previously, and it presents a contrast between the inept and corrupt leadership of Eli and his sons with that of Samuel. The chapter also anticipates the coming monarchy through Hannah's prayers and the ascent of David. Chapters 3 and 4 detail the important threats that the Philistines posed to Israel. Chapters 8 through 15, it introduces the people's demand for a king, followed by the selection of Saul. Chapters 9 through 11, we get Samuel's speech, which is very beautiful. In fact, there are speeches here that are somewhat lengthy, but exceedingly beautifully worded. They are not the speeches in the vein of Joshua, nor are they in the vein of Moses, but they are nonetheless beautiful. Okay, in chapters 13 through 15, it tells of Saul's rebellion and rejection. And then where we are going to be working today, chapter 16, really we're working in 25, but chapter 16 through 2 Samuel, first chapter, we're introduced to David, and we are provided with a contrast between David and Saul. And we understand that David will receive God's Spirit while Saul loses God's Spirit. So we have an evil situation going on and a divine situation in contrast going on. David steps out and he defeats Goliath. Um, and Samuel becomes more pronounced in his work just before his death. Um, we have also the Israeli victory against the Palestinians. And we get this, we talked about power as being one of those key takeaways. We get this idea that David is interested in pleasing Yahweh. Saul, on the other hand, wants to please the quote unquote humans around him. Go back and think about the situation where the women are singing after this victory over the Palestinians. They're talking about, well, Saul killed thousands and David killed 10,000s. That didn't go well with Saul. He needed that. But as it ends, we have David lamented the death of Saul and his son Jonathan. Now, the transition that we need to understand is that we are going from a transition of a theocracy or a state ruled by religious leaders to a monarchy or a state ruled by a political leader. And read very closely through there. You'll see that Israel has started to look around and see that, well, the other countries, the other nations around us have a king. You know, I'm not sure. It doesn't indicate that they needed a king, but they wanted a king, which is something we're going to see. It's called a motif. We'll see it over and over in the writers going forward. They have it, we want it. It's not, definitely may not be good for you, but they wanted to do that. So David represents God's ideal king. And this is the man that we're going to meet in the Valley of Priam and in the village of Carmel. So they're moving away, the Israelites are moving away from the religious leaders to the more political leaders. And we will talk shortly about why this is not a good thing. So God was ambivalent towards this minority, and it escalates the situation as we go through. Israel refused to believe, you know, that God and his religious laws are adequate to rule the people. But on the other hand, God willingly chooses Saul to be king, identifying Saul as the deliverer of the people. Um, Even though it may have been a contradiction, he did give them what they want. But Saul's reign was a chaotic and in many cases it was a tragic reign. Again, don't forget we're talking about the the themes that we mentioned: the sovereignty of God and the relationship between David and God. So, if we wanted to conclude this, we would talk about the characters for this particular period, and we would make note that coming from Judges, we seem to have this understanding that a king would be given over all us and the failures of Israel would disappear, and they would faithfully follow the Lord's leadership through, though not as it was in Judges. So God decides to grant them their demand, but he has one particular person in mind, and that person is the son of Jesse. And I mention that because we are getting ready to introduce our uncles and our characters a little bit more. There's a 300-year period between Joshua's conquest of the promised land and where we are now. The older men of Israel who came from Jehovah and who had been taught and understood things were actually the ones who wanted to keep or wanted a king. But the younger ones knew better. But again, we have the story that is being told by Samuel, Nathan, and Gad, who are covering this period of approximately 102 years. So this demand for a king uh, starts with this idea and concept of kingship. So we want to take a very quick look at the demand for a king and the women in the narrative of David. So in this particular narrative by Samuel, we do have the idea of kingship, but the women seem to play the role, as I said earlier, of being prophets. And you'll remember that as we go through and take a very quick look at the speech that Abigail gives to David when she goes to plead for her household, her husband, and her household. Those who supported that prospect of David being king, they constituted the younger ideas. There's no subversive movement here, other than the fact that it wouldn't have been a good thing to say in the presence of Saul, because you had to remember that Yahweh's will, Yahweh's desires are the things that we need to remember. But Saul, on the other hand, seems to appears to establish his own dynasty here, with having forgotten why he's being put in the position. And something interesting, we have a narrator's position here, and the narrator is usually the women speaking dialogue through the women, and they are the opposite of those who are happy with the king, quote unquote, that they have now. So we look at 1 Samuel 8, chapter 4 through the 8 verses. Um, we are told that these elders have offended Yahweh. But then again, if we take a look at Fryman Kinsey, who is one of the feminist writers, and she tells the stories that these women needed to be there. They had to be there in order to show the patterns that were emerging, and they had to parallel the plots and the plot lines and the things that Samuel needed to carry out. So there was enough enthusiasm there, especially in our character that we're meeting right now. There's so much enthusiasm in Abigail that it's easy to understand why she would, without, it doesn't tell us how she knew, but the fact that she should have believed in David. Could have been the things that she heard around her household, but even though customarily she should have been a subordinate to Nabal, but in fact she actually sort of managed the household, and she did the things that needed to be done. So she became one of those persons who supported him. There are apparently some exaggerated stereotypes here, but the idea that this also can be a moral allegory, it tells us the right from the wrong here, and it's obvious, it's written in such a manner that they want you to see that, and that this now becomes not just a historical story or an allegory, but it becomes a part of wisdom literature. We talked about the two groups, the elders and the women, and we'll move on past that. But we know that Abigail was part of the women and Nabal was part of the others. He's rich, he's powerful, he has everything he needs. He's what Levison calls an autocratic, arrogant fool, per se. And our scene basically with him, we don't really see his encounter with the men that David set to ask about the hospitality issue of sharing the food because he had provided protection. Uh, we see shortly after that Nabal is in a feast, and he's inebriated at a feast, and it's a banquet, like a royal feast. In verse 36, we're still in First Samuel chapter 25, and it's a royal banquet for him. I mean, he's too busy devouring and enjoying his richness to be concerned with someone. And that the question he is, well, who is David? Who is the son of Jesse? You know, but the servants knew, but he was so big and so important that he did not know. He did not know. So in a way, he serves as proxy for the elders of Israel, those who uh, wanted and enjoyed um, Nabal and Samuel. Now, Abigail, on the other hand, she's a female representative, and she is humble in her posture, and she is wise, and she's actually running the household. This had to be a very large household because we're talking about the thousands of animals um, that Nabal had. And as we get to the end of that, for Abigail, it's a new beginning as the wife of David. But as we get to the end, on the other hand, it is the end of Nabal. So as we go through, let's take a little bit more um, deeper dive into where we are and what we're trying to get done here. So when we take a look at what they symbolize, especially Abigail and Nabal, we understand this idea of kingship versus kingship. It's sort of like today, leader versus leader. Which one is best for the people? So the women function, and Abigail in particular, as an agent of Yahweh, as a stand-in, as a representative of Israel who demanded a new and a better king, one who was not satisfied with things as they were, but one who wanted to satisfy and follow the teachings of Yahweh and have Yahweh be happy to say, a man after my own heart. That person was not going to be Nabal. So the themes again, we have the sovereignty of God. Talked a little bit about that. Um, God does not choose who he uses based on appearances. So he didn't see a burly man there. He has this very diminutive young woman there. That obedience is better than sacrifice. We get examples of friendship. And then we get the courage of David against the giant. And that's that story of Goliath, which goes earlier prior to this chapter 25 that we're in. So we are looking at the anointing, the power here that's used to anoint a king. Now, going back a little bit further, let's take a look at the divisions of this. If we start in chapter 2 of 2 Samuel, we get David seeks payment for protection. He is run. He's on the lam. He's hiding out. So he's found a place in the wilderness where he can, and he actually serves. I don't like to say serves as a Robin Hood. No, he serves as one who is actually helping those shepherds, helping the shepherds to make sure that there are not robbers and thieves who take the flocks. Nabal didn't buy that, not at all. And in chapters 14 through 35, we get the intervention of Abigail. In chapters 36 through 42, we get the death of Nabal and David's proposal to Abigail, which I thought was quite interesting as we go through there. The setting we've talked about being in there, but we also have the cultural setting. We mentioned earlier about Samuel's death in the morning, and everybody seemed to have loved him because he had time for the people. He was indeed, quote unquote, an enlightened prophet who took the time. And I should say this later, but I'll say it now. The story of Abigail uh, resonates into the Hebrew history, and she is referred to as one of the seven female prophets. Tells you what kind of woman that we're going to be dealing with. So our characters in our story are Abigail, well, God first, Abigail, Nabal's unnamed servant, David's unnamed messengers, David's 400 armed warriors who are going to attack Nabal, and the 600 followers of David, and the 5 female servants of Abigail who go with her after she has sent this food to them. So we have, as it were, the husband and wife are described by their personality, and you'll notice the definite division. They're opposites each other. The name of the man was Nabal. The name of the wife was Abigail. Abigail means joy to her father, brought joy to her father. And the women, uh, and this particular woman was clever and she was beautiful, but the man was surly and mean. And just basically retelling it as is written. And as we go through, we will see that the characters and the characteristics that Samuel presents are both very telling. Um, they are very human-like, which is something interesting. And I did not mention the narrator as a character, but we do have a narrator who's really almost omniscient. He knows exactly what they're thinking, what they're doing, and he puts it down here for us to read. So the actual story, let's take a look at it. We'll look at it in terms of the basic hard characteristics. I like the way Sarah Boswell uh, describes Abigail. She is a woman with a message, and we know now what her message was, but how she handled an emergency situation is actually phenomenal. It is really an interesting situation. Um, she is not the one the servants of the messengers from David uh, approach. It is actually Nabal who does this. This is the time of shearing, which is why David thought it would be a good time to approach him in the spirit of hospitality that is on display throughout the Old Testament. But he is rude. He is basically he sends them away. They go back to David and they report to him exactly, what was said. And now David is not out of food. Remember now, he's feeding all of these people. But one of the scholars said, several of the scholars suggest that perhaps he's out of fresh food because they've not killed any of the sheep. They've not taken anything because he asked for it. Here we have a man who could have been an poor, a mercenary, but he didn't do that. He asked for what was needed. When the servants go back and they tell Abigail about what has been said, Abigail knows that she must work. And we come upon our first major characteristic that we have here, and that is one of haste. We have to deal with the fact that really, I think it may be her second characteristic because her first characteristic is hope. When she's told this narrative here by the servant, she knows that she has to have hope in God and she prays to God that things are going to work out. But the second one happens to be haste. One of the things that's really admirable about Abigail is the fact that all of this was prepared that she's about to carry, about to give to David. It's all prepared and it doesn't take long for her to prepare it. We're talking about dressed lambs. We're talking about fig cakes. We're talking about just the things that Nabal basically would have had at his feast. She has those things and she prepares and she gives them to David. She sends them along on donkeys to David. Now she's going to follow, but she sends that along. And it's very interesting. And I love to read it as I get older. You can almost visualize the picture. You have David coming with 400 people, 400 warriors, because he's told them to put their swords on, to gird their swords around them, which basically meant the fabric that held up the swords had to wrap the body 3 times. So they're already mounted and they're going and they meet at a crossroads because Abigail and her servants are coming and well, the food's there, and she's coming, and she gets off her donkey, and again, she's not walking, so we're talking having money here. She gets off and she bows at his feet, and she talks about the feet, and we won't get into it too much today, but the feet in Samuel's writing become another of the motif. She bows down uh, put her head almost to the ground, and she's talking to him, saying, "Okay, don't blame my husband, blame me. I'll take the blame," you know. But she needs to do this because David is very angry at this point. The writing is literally beautiful between these two. David begins to come down. He accepts the supplies and he begins to come down. So haste has paid off because she did. Had she waited and had excuses for not doing what was needed to be done, it may have had a different outcome. And what we're just talking about was the humility. So we have had hope, we have had haste, we have had humility here. The fact that her husband was haughty, that's the word I like to use. He was haughty, definitely inhospitable by anyone's definition. She, on the other hand, is the opposite. And I like the fact that the servants who approached her says, but he has, the warriors who have been around, they've not only protected sheep, they've protected us. They've done nothing bad to us. Again, prompting her to act very quickly because, we're talking about a renegade. We're talking about, quote unquote, could have been riffraffs, but we're talking about David. But Abigail sees something in him. She knows something that is actually good. And which brings us to our next one, which is honor. She paid honor to him. She referred to him as my Lord. She referred to herself as the handmaiden or their maidservant. She lowers herself. She's not the lady of the manor that she is in her home, where she has all these servants and everything at her beck and call, where her husband is enjoying the feast. He's drinking an awful lot. But no, here she is just an humble lady who has come to plead. And she never actually uses the words, like don't kill my husband and don't destroy uh, the men in my household, because that is basically what David had said to the 400 men who were going with him. We're going to kill all the males. That too was part of the military tactic of the day. The women were going to be taken captive and the males were going to be killed. And Abigail later does become a captive, and David has to rescue her. So in her speech with him, and it's a beautiful speech, and it's one of the longest ones that we have there in the Bible. And in the speech, she tells him that you can't have this kind of quote unquote blood guilt. This is not what's supposed to happen to you. Yahweh, Yahweh has chosen you for something even greater. And if you're reading very carefully, you can understand how that becomes. You can almost sense David becoming calmer and calmer as she spoke to him. But the honor, because there's this thing of the men having a conflict between their pride and their shame. Nabal, you know, even if he had recognized who David was, that there was conflict between he and Saul, and he probably knew it, but not David's name, but Saul he would have known because he would have been one of the upper class persons because he was one of the wealthiest men in the area. But um, that's not the way that his wife approached David. Uh, and she tells him in such a prophetic way, in such a quiet, even manner, that, if you do this killing, you will have blood on your hands. And that is not going to be what you need to be the successor that God has chosen you to be. And he gives her safe passage home. Now, we have scholars who say he was attracted to her at this point because she was renowned for her beauty. But beauty, not necessarily the outside that he saw, but he saw a genuine beauty within her, a totally different kind of thing. So he gives her safe passage home. But when she gets home, she does not tell Nabal, who is sleeping off a hangover, until the next morning. And the reason for not doing that is that, basically she's sort of worried about his reaction, how he's going to react. So when he does get the information, his heart becomes stone. Well, almost all of the scholars says he had a heart attack, and 10 days later he died. And upon hearing of his death, David sent named messengers to Abigail, and basically saying, David said, I want you to come with us. Um, he wants to propose marriage to you. He wants you for his wife. And I love her response. It's really more romantic than anything that Shakespeare has written when she agrees that she's going to go with him. And she does, and they become married. And they have one child later on. So we have that story. That's the hearkening part of it. So you've had your hope, your haste, your humility, you've had your honor, and you've had your hearkening in this particular story of Abigail. So the characters in this story did not need to be rewritten. However, Josephus did rewrite the story of Abigail. So he rewrote First Samuel pretty much. And in it, he does change minor things. He makes Nabal a Syphilite rather than a Canaanite. Um, and as far as Abigail is concerned, he seems to stress more of her beauty than the shrewdness, the wisdom that she had, as in the original Hebrew text. But you got to remember, Josephus is writing so that David becomes the protagonist. We're looking at it from the point of view of Abigail. Not that David's not important, but she is there to, and we said it earlier, she's there in the camp, quote unquote, those who know and understand that the Lord is going to make um, David king in the future. She had the idea of sight, and by stopping him from killing, calming him, and stopping him from killing, going back and committing basically a massacre because he didn't get his way. That was something that he had to do. He has to mature. If you want to look at a beautiful story of maturity, you can look at his story, David's story in relationship to Abigail, and David's story in relationship to Bathsheba. Great deal of maturity occurred during that time period. So what we have, if you want to look at Josephus, you have to understand what his agenda was and appreciate it for what it is. So the speech that she gives um, is one that actually defines the way that a woman should behave, and actually it's rather common. It's rather common, although there's a lot of bowing and a lot of my lord and all that that we wouldn't do today, but the wording is what is good. Now let's go and talk about her as a wife. We pointed that out as head of the household, as one who is wise, not delaying, but moving on and doing what needed to be done, said basically that Abigail was pretty much prepared for emergencies as they occurred. She needed to be prepared, otherwise, she could have, the crisis there could have gotten out of hand. Now, as one who is a diplomatic person in terms of things that could have really been really been bad, um, we have to remember that the future king had a problem too. Although he wasn't as arrogant as Nabal, he did, not knowing who he was, sort of pricked his pride a little bit, especially when he sees himself as out there doing what is right, even though it is in an outlaw vein. Because again, I'm bringing right to the forefront this conflict between what was with the elders and Saul and what is to be with the women and David. So, but the fact that she was able to use diplomacy, um, is an important factor here. We're not saying that David is not the central character because he is. So it almost goes back to the portrayal of the women in Genesis, which Samuel had nothing to do with, but they are given some very strong and rather dynamic characteristics. We have David understanding what the law was by not being a part of those who he himself is labeled as a bandit and he himself did not act as a bandit. He acts in a very reasonable way, um, even though his first reaction is not one that we want to do. So after he dies, and Nabal dies 10 days after being told what Abigail did, and there are those who still question today: was she a good wife? Did she develop? I am reading this from the book of Samuel, it being a book of, for me, a book of wisdom literature as well as a history. I think she saved him, saved her household more so than disobeying. She was the one who handled the products in the household. He was not available to be asked about whether or not these could be done. And basically, he had said no, but we're talking about what was going to happen if he didn't get it. So he did get it. So she honored him in a way by not asking, but at the same time doing what had to be done. She did what needed to be done. She conformed to what society uh, said, but it wasn't exactly what the law demanded because they basically Nabal owned everything. And the what this is a patriarchal society. So when she left her father's house, she went into his house, and his house he was the one who was over everything. Um, there was no ratification by him, is what I'm saying. But not only was he very important in his house, but he was an important political leader and an economic person because we said he had wealth. Was she unfaithful? I don't see the unfaithfulness because she did say, "Put this on me, don't put it on my husband." And she even says, don't really listen to what he says, because he sometimes says things, that are rude. But David, on the other hand, and he's talking, he wants to kill everything that pisses against the wall. So it's one of those situations where you read and you have to go back to the culture of that particular time. So the political role and the cultural role, you know, those have to be taken into consideration. But I believe Samuel was correct in including this in there about uh, Abigail because she understood, and I again say, I don't know how, other than the fact that she's a prophet, she recognized that the Lord had anointed David and that he was going to be the ruler, that he was going to be the prince. So when she declared, "For the Lord will certainly make my Lord a sure house, because my Lord is fighting the battles of the Lord." So she knows that. And basically, he says to her, "I'm very glad that you came today. You stopped me from doing something that I would not and should not have done." So her role in this narrative, which started out to be a very simple role, but it becomes one that epitomized what a woman could be. She was not a normal woman of Israel, but what a woman could be who was inspired by God. She is set up as a contrasting figure as opposed to her husband. She is set up as one who has the wisdom to see what is going to happen later on and to believe that Yahweh was going to deliver. Now go all the way back to Genesis because there had been this promise of a king even back then. But in a way, they're getting ahead. The Israelites, are getting ahead of the plan, but God had David in mind. I mean, the, everything had been placed. He had been anointed. Even at his anointing, he is not in the house when Samuel comes. All the other brothers are anointed, and it's like, in there one more? And yeah, he's out in the field tending the sheep, but get him. Well, it's almost that kind of thing. She's sensitive to what has happened. She is very sensitive to what has happened and what will happen. That is a very nice way to say it. And she is, metaphorically speaking, she is the nation of Israel, the best of the nation of Israel that what is to come. And Saul is really representative, more so, not being a judge but a king, but acting like a judge, um, more human than he should have been in a way. But the shedding of the blood guilt, you understand it better when you read this story. So Nabal represents Saul, and Abigail actually represents the better part. I like to say the earlier part of David, because David changes as things go on. So, from a theological point of view, the story has a turning point, and it leads us to God's purpose of salvation. So, what are the kind of lessons that we learn and can learn? This is one of the few stories where a character presents life lessons more so than the actual, overall story. We are told that she is wise. We are told that well, the beauty is not used in a negative way. She would have gone to see David in any aspect. We are told that she is diplomatic, and we have that demonstrated by her visit to him, and by her way that the servants come to her and they talk to her, which is really something that's really, really important. So we see all of these in her hope, her haste, her humility, and her honor within chapter uh, 25 of the first book of Samuel. If we wanted to say, well, what does this do for us today? How is it going to help us as we come through the day? We can say, okay, I have Abigail's virtues, and I can go to Proverbs 16, chapter 6 verse, and I can see how much better it is to get wisdom than gold, to get insight rather than silver. I can understand the humility part from James chapter 4, verse 10. Humble yourself before the Lord, and he will lift you up. I can understand the generosity by looking at 2 Corinthians 9, chapter 7 verse. Each of you should give what you have decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. I can understand the godliness in 1 Timothy 4, chapter 8 verse. For physical training is of some value, but godliness has value for all things, holding promise for both the present life and the life to come. So the story of Abigail continues to resonate with us today because her virtues are actually Christian virtues. She is a courageous individual, and that one lesson that we must not forget and must be taught over and over, um, by doing what she did, by putting herself in the line of fire to protect her household. It teaches the power of diplomacy, humility, but most importantly, it teaches the power of forgiveness. It is that forgiveness factor that we have to be reminded of day to day. The whole piece allows us to do that. Conflict resolution does not have to be physical, but it can be done through a wise intervention, as was by Abigail. Wisdom and diplomacy uh, can be done and approached to serve as a reminder. Remember, we said we were talking about the power of the virtues in diffusing the tension and fostering an understanding. We have to trust in God's justice. And that was the one thing she did. She started off, we were saying, when she heard of the emergency that Nabal had turned down David's request, she understood immediately that she needed to pray to God and to trust that God was going to give her the answer that she needed. She didn't take matters into her own hands as some of us would have done, but she relied on God to bring about the just resolution. Now, as far as the humility and the respect, well, throughout the interactions with David, Abigail exhibited humility and respect by acknowledging her own position and showing deference to the anointed king. It just reminds us of the timeless values and qualities that we should encourage in ourselves as well as in others. Her example teaches us how to approach challenging situations with wisdom and always have a commitment to peace. Now, as I said earlier, this is one of the few characters where Dr. Mike was able to get lessons from almost all of her actions. So, all of her actions, including the conflict resolution, the trusting in God, those are like things that just kept me going and finding more and more. It teaches us to apply those lessons that happened in ancient Israel to our lives today. We have to have wisdom and insight into any situation, and we have to remember that it is not ours to do, but the Lord. So we have lessons from her story, and we have the one thing that we have to remember is that we show respect even in challenging situations. It would have done her no good to go and say, I am Mrs. Nabal of Meron, and you're not going to do this, and you're not going that would have been the wrong thing. But God gave her just the right way to go, gave her the right postures to assemble, and in order to get the things that we needed to get done. Her plea was a desperate plea, but God had unloosened David's heart. Not only did Nabal's heart become the stone and he died, but he was an evil man. But David's heart, being filled with anger, was loosened by the thing that Abigail said and the way she said it. There would not have been the kind of legacy that we have from this story that we can build on. We have a narrator who tells us the story of David and how, even in his humanistic state, his quick anger was doused by the humble and noble reactions of a woman. We have a character who continues to live within those of us who choose to let her character comes forth and not our own. We have an understanding of the portrayal of what David saw that caused him to want to marry her. There's that overriding question, and we're getting ready to end. Did he marry her for political reasons? Well, almost all of the scholars will agree marrying her did not hurt his political situation because when he went to Hebron, where he became quote unquote the king. He was already king because Samuel had anointed him, but here is a public annunciation of his kingship. Um, he had all that region under his control through his marriage to Abigail. Did he love her? Is this a romantic story? It's not really that kind of story. There's a respect there, but not that kind of quote unquote rom-com comedy thing that we have today. But Abigail's marriage to David is one of those that serves as a powerful reminder of the impact one person can make in the face of adversity and the importance of wisdom and diplomacy in resolving conflict. I hope you have enjoyed us today as we share it with you. Join us again next week as we take another look of women in the Bible. Thank you, and may God bless you.